one.
And I love robot movies, so the idea that I could work with that was also very, very exciting. I mean, Kris is legendary within the animation community, obviously, and for, speaking for all of us and everyone else on the crew, once they found out Kris was attached to this project, people were beating down every door in the studio to try to get onto the film. Kris's filmography and Kris's aesthetic are so singular and so unique. And it's the perfect marriage with what this project is and wanted to be, and everybody just wanted to do right by that, and work with the master.
It's a little over 80 minutes of music in a 100-minute film. Yeah, yeah. I mean, Kris, just like Jeff said, is such an amazing collaborator and so open from the very beginning and so trusting, which I really appreciated all the way to the very end. There were so many times where I was continuing to tinker with cues that Kris had already approved, and oftentimes there's fear around continuing to mess with something, and Kris was always very, very welcoming and open to that, and that always made me feel very encouraged to continue to try things and mess around. But our initial conversations were all about how much music would play a huge role in this film because there isn't much dialogue, and how there were going to be a lot of times where music was responsible for conveying a lot of the emotions that we were going to feel. There were even times where we would get a little bit further with a piece of music and Kris would actually start taking out some dialogue because it felt like, a lot of the emotion was starting to become clear and palpable with how that scene was feeling. Having that kind of trust and encouragement was just so heartwarming and such an honor to be a part of.
Well, Kris said right out of the gate that to not be afraid of emotion. He said that to all of us, to embrace emotion and not shy away from it. And so I knew that we could kind of go for it. The other thing about working with Kris that is such a wonderful quality of Kris, he is so collaborative, and he is the first person to be enthusiastic about someone else's creativity, which I find amazing because he's so creative himself and has ideas pouring out of him all of the time. But he's the first one to jump up and go, oh my God, that's amazing. That's the best joke in the world if someone else thinks of something else. But it fits within his vision. And as Kris Bowers stated, the vision was very clearly laid out from the beginning, which is to see how you could get so much emotion and so many things adjacent to each other, which the very first sequence we worked on, the accident, which is the bear chase and Roz falling on the egg, there was no dialogue in the scene. And the amazing John Puglisi boarded it beautifully, and it already indicated exactly what Kris was going for, which was that we would have moments where we would embrace sound effects and have no music. We would have moments where we focus on music. We would have moments in which it's pure acting with a character that does not have a mouth and does not have a brow, and so it's not traditional acting. So then I knew we were going to have to rely heavily on the animation department to be able to have Roz emote, but not be afraid of leaving space for that. From an editing standpoint, when you're cutting to a drawing that doesn't have a mouth, it's like you have to believe in the process and know that one day that character, when I cut to her, she's going to have a reaction. I'm going to understand what she's feeling. And so Kris just imbues the process with a lot of faith like that. Like, don't shy away from, make sure to cut to her, give her the reaction shot. Don't worry about putting music in this particular moment because it's going to make the music shine in the next moment. And so it's just a back and forth dialogue that is between the two of us, but between all the different departments also, and who are also contributing to this conversation at the same time.
I think you have to rely on the body language a lot of times, and also the shot choices will tell you how to feel about certain things. But I think that was really hard for us to find ways to make you care about her when she's not having human emotions. I would say that was one of the hardest tasks for us to achieve.
Let me take that from the animation side. Visual effects supervisor Jeff. It was a struggle, and we wavered for a minute, but someone wise once said, trust the limitation in the design, right? There was something elegant about the illustrations in Peter Brown's novel, and we really wanted to pay homage to that, and so we were extremely hesitant to add a mouth. And we decided to try a lot of different ideas for how to get the audience to fall in love with Roz. And we came up with this great idea to treat Roz, her eyes more like a DSLR camera lens. So you can have these kind of micro twitches kind of in the focusing. You could use the bellows like a Hasselblad, to kind of give you a dilation. You can, be able to move the eye around in space. You can adjust the LED scroll almost like she's processing, right? So we had these very subtle elements that we could use to give the audience cues to kind of her thought process and how she was communicating. And then we added a couple other subtle things because we still struggled with the mouth, right? We were still having a hard time. We got the processing, we could get her to think, but we couldn't get her to emote or communicate. So we came up with this great idea to use her edge lines for kind of a status indicator, right? Kind of something more like a cyan is her daytime running light, your Alexa, if you will. But if she's running low on power or if she's in danger, it might go to yellow, orange, or red. But we had this great idea of like, what if we actually time and scope spatially where the lines are, kind of time to her vocal performance. So you would notice that, as she speaks, the brightness would change, right? And the first shot test that we had done is in the lodge when Brightbill's confronting her, and she says, there was an accident. And we did this test, where we kind of timed the brightness of the lines and we scoped it kind of spatially to her upper torso. And that was the first time we knew that we were onto something. But you stop thinking about a mouth, you stop thinking about kind of the limitations, and you understand it. It really clicked, and that's when we knew we were onto something. And I think that exploration we brought back into the story department. And then we started using that design language. Kind of we're drawing kind of the cyan lines when she would speak or when she was communicating.
Yeah, but all that complexity and subtlety that we did design into her and figure out in animation. You guys didn't have any of that. So usually it was all about, don't just say it, show it. I think that was probably what really always came through the boards and even into the animation that made it really strong. Painting has been my vehicle for working in this medium for a long time. So when Kris and I started talking about what we loved about traditional animation, banding being one of the biggest ones, and of course the Miyazaki background painting department, another that we just love that that feeling that an artist made this for you and that you're being taken into their view of the world, and being able to start there and just go forward in illustrating movie moments in a new painterly style was probably the most fun we had. We did these big pitches that Kris did narration over with sound, with music, and other references cut in, and that's how we actually really got to see the visual tone of the film very early. We didn't have anything moving, we just had paintings and some extra footage in there, and that just kind of, we felt like, okay, this really has the potential to be special. And it also, I was talking a little bit earlier about sincerity and how the painting style isn't too overdone. It actually feels like that's what you would paint if you were there, and I love that feeling. So all the way until going to our first lighting dailies, or one of the early ones, and Kris is sitting there, and we've got a shot ready to go, but it's just frozen on one frame, and he thought that was the painting. We hit play, and the thing started playing, and your other question was about what it's like working with Kris. He's not just the captain, he's the biggest fan of what you're doing. He just freaked out, and just, that's, you couldn't ask for anything else. That kind of feeling of, all right, we've crafted something that we're all even being surprised by.
Absolutely. So I write enough of the script that Christy Soper, our casting director, can get an idea of what she's targeting, And she came in with every one of our choices, and that was always our first choice. And I think the best example of this whole thing would be Lupita in particular, because it's a collaboration. They don't come in and just read the lines and then leave. In particular with Roz, there was a huge amount of heavy lifting that Lupita was going to be doing with her voice emotionally, because Roz, of course, has the added limitation of not having a mouth. So, and I was just, this is the kind of thing I like, because she had a lot of questions before she agreed to do it. She really wanted to make sure this was a collaborative environment. And our very first recording session in New York, we didn't step up to the mic for over an hour. We just discussed Roz, her thinking patterns, and she's a complex character. And watching how Lupita deconstructed Roz to really understand, how does Roz process things? So that was, and it never ended throughout the entire process. So I would always leave a recording session with the notes that were generated by our discussions, and then I would apply those, and for the next recording session. And there were a lot of iterations as well. So each and every one of our voice cast customized their characters. No one more so than Lupita and Roz. And then we did the added thing, or she did the added thing, where she developed this beginning, middle, and end voice, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. And what you hear in the beginning, nothing was done electronically to change her voice. That's all performance. And so she came up with this thing that we termed engineered optimism. So the bit that she's doing when she's walking through the forest and advertising, she's looking for whoever literally bought her, and she's like, I'm here, and she pushed her voice, hello, into this higher register, and we record things out of order. So in every recording session, we just had to be very, very mindful of, is this a phase 1, phase 2, or phase 3 scene, as she would bounce around and do those. But yeah, she was really the creative lead on Roz.
And also, just to expand upon that, the other actors too also had some influence on how their characters were carried through, and in particular Pedro. It was in getting to work with him the first several sessions, just discovering how goofy and charming and playful he actually is in real life, and we kept kind of pushing him to bring more of that into his role as Fink, and he because his instinct was to do it more seriously, but the more we could coax him into just being himself, that really opened up doors in terms of us figuring out who Fink was and where to go with him, and Pedro even actually kind of said at the end of it all how proud he was that this is the first time he's playing something so close to himself.
Because I always go back and tailor things, and for him, it's not in the film. There's a thing that we had that he recorded, and then that piece of the story fell out. But there was a point at which Roz showed Fink her tablet, and there were things that you could order. And he was trying to make his robot more powerful, so he's looking through this catalog and he saw something, and the line that I wrote was, "Ooh, can we get that?" But when he read it, he said, "Ooh, can we get that?" And he read it like a little kid, like in a grocery store wanting something. And that was always my touchdown, with Fink's character, because he really is he's a vulnerable little kid in some ways, and Pedro did that. And that's going to power us through the second half of the movie, because there's a lot of tension created. But I was also interested in the idea that Roz didn't know how far she'd gone emotionally until this moment, and she's looking up, because if you build a snowman or you raise a gosling, eventually there's heartbreak at the end of that road. It's going to fly away, or it's going to melt. I know this because I lived in Colorado, and I had to watch them all die slowly. Always know it. So the moment he disappears, she, without saying anything, she suddenly bursts, she breaks character and she starts to run, because now she's pure emotion. And that was the emotional cliff, because she's working on this problem of getting Bright Bill into the air and doesn't realize there's a precipice at the end of it. And so we literally do that. She runs off to the edge of this cliff, and she waits there, and that is emotionally what she just experienced. It's now graphically represented on the screen.
And my first pass at it, I wrote this piece of music, and I just had a daughter before I joined the project. My daughter was about 5 or 6 months old, and I wrote this piece of music, and I felt really great about it. I felt really emotional, and I played it for Kris, and Kris was like, "This isn't right," and he was like, "You should imagine dropping Coda off for college." And I was like, that is what I imagined, actually. And I was very confused. And then we talked about really what was happening in that moment. And the more we talked about it, especially when I got home, I realized that I didn't want to imagine that much complexity in that moment. I remember looking at my daughter and thinking about like dropping her off at college with the complexity that's happening between Bright Bill and Roz, like, you know, having possibly irreparably harmed her unintentionally, or, you know, not saying I love you and not saying goodbye really, and maybe never seeing her ever again. And that level of emotion was just, you know, kind of like waterfalls kind of moment essentially. And so I just started writing something based on that feeling, and my process is usually, I have a background in jazz piano, so I usually just improvise trying to find something that makes me feel the same way that this scene and this story was already making me feel, and that conversation with Kris was making me feel. And so I came up with this theme that I felt really good about, and came back and shared it with Kris and Jeff and Mary, and Kris actually was so encouraging to, then he was like, you're on the right track now, this feels really great. Now write it away from picture, and you know, just write the music just to see where it goes, and then we'll all work together to figure out how to shape the scene after that. And so having that emotion just kind of charging me was how I kind of came up with the main theme for that sequence, and then for the rest of the movie. From the get-go, we had a very strong Act 2 moment. Rarely in these films, when we're making them, Act 2 is normally the most troublesome spot that takes us forever to solve. We kind of were blessed in having a really, really strong Act 2 ending that helped inform what came before and what came after. And this was one of the earliest sequences that Kris initially boarded and that we were continuing to develop. And as Kris mentioned, it was one of the first cues. So really defining this as early as we did, it is the heart of the film, and it's such an emotional core of the film, and to have that early really helped us understand everything that came before and after.
And there's something that we've lost along the way, you know, and we mentioned those kind of those early paintings from Tyrus Wong on Bambi or Snow White, Miyazaki. There's something endearing about a hand-drawn or hand-illustrated painting, and, you know, the impetus that Kris and Ramon had given us to execute was, how do we get some of that back? And so I had a look on Bad Guys, and you know, and pushed a lot of kind of non-photorealistic looks on that, and then that allowed kind of Puss in Boots to run, which allowed Robot to fly, and we really just were standing on the shoulders of giants from a lot of the non-photorealistic tools that we had developed. And the reason I bring that up is because when you watch that sequence, you don't want to see every blade of grass or every feather. All of that, or every leaf in a tree, right? All of that information is superfluous to the core of what that sequence really means. So we always wanted to think about, in every department, and this is what I learned on the last couple of films, is like, every department needs to be thinking about what is the final result as if you were an illustrator painting that frame, right? So in modeling, I don't care about every leaf, right? I'm gonna model things in brushstrokes and silhouettes and splatters, and look dev, right? I don't care about physically correct shaders. I want things to, put detail where I feel like it's critical for the audience to look, right? And lighting, I'm gonna be scoping the look in a way that really focuses us, to the core message of that shot. And every department was really kind of in tune with the heart and soul of that sequence, right? And I want to impress upon the fact that every artist put so much heart and soul into this movie, and I think that's why that sequence resonated so much, right? Because you know that the boards are powerful and the score, just incredible, but like everyone thinking about how the final frame is going to look and come across, and I think that was so powerful. For the artists, and really rewarding artistically, right? Because they were able to kind of put their own artistic sensibilities into the final frame. And I don't know how it came across for you or not.
Yes, it's crazy because it's a simple sequence in a way, but it's got all the complexity of that crowd, right? So a sequence like that doesn't get to lighting for a while, which in a way was kind of perfect. Like, there's a lot of things on this film that timing-wise just worked out so good because we had a lighting department that was all the way there, ramped up, right, ready to go. And so we're like, no, we're gonna play with the look of these geese. It's not about like Jeff said, the individual feathers, it's like how much orange red light is hitting them, because that's the timer. All these birds are going to take off, and Bright Bill's got to join them, and this feeling of taking off into the morning light was the big kind of art direction cinematography idea that was working behind the scenes to kind of, you know, manipulate you emotionally. And it was just great how it all came together, because there's all this grass that all these geese are in, and if you look closely, like it's all reacting to the birds moving around. But our style is great because it's almost graphic in a way. We don't, in CG, used to shade every little thing as a highlight, a drop shadow, a cast shadow, all this extra information. We actually get rid of a lot of that, because when you paint, you're trying to focus the eye. So you'll put highlights where you want. You'll not put all that extra detail anywhere else. You'll just really work in the way that a painter would. So we ended up in lighting with lighters that are actually painting shots and not just hitting render.
It's even the geese. Like, if you look at some of the shots, a lot of the geese are reduced to like one brushstroke of hue, and that is it. Because that's how you would approach that type of shot when you're painting, right? And same thing with the grass. And that's really tricky, is like if you're in the character effects department, how are you going to move grass and plants that are just physically just splatters of paint? Like, you know, like, so there's really challenging problems that are kind of imperceptible to the audience. Right, like how do you rig a tree that's made out of brushstrokes and splatters? Right, that's just insane. Right, like, you know, how does the character move when when Fink's tail is just made out of brushstrokes? Like, if you looked at that, like, how does that feel when things are not physical? So we almost had to reimagine all of our workflows and kind of take a step back and be like, you know, how would I paint this? You know, like, how would I want this to move in motion? Because, you know, all of it, we wanted to make sure that we were reevaluating and not just putting in detail unnecessarily, and just really want to take a critical eye into what was important, you know, to really kind of, you know, for the whole of the shot.
So many of us got started at CalArts, and I was amongst those that our animation room was on the ground floor, and it was room A113. So myself, John Lasseter, and so many others traced their origin to A113. Etched inside of Roz's lens, it's almost the very first thing you actually see in the movie. As we pull out, there's an A113 like inside of her lens. The only movie I couldn't hide it in was The Croods. There was, we put palm trees that like made that shape. Everything except that.